parameters you want. So if you called Grani plus and just put the parameters in for Grani, it would behave as normal. Every parameter you add into it with a function call is then going to just replace Grani's default behavior with the call to that function. So, like I said, what's new is you can change sample rate, panning, distance, reverb amount, and amplitudes over the length of an individual grain. Replace any envelope with your own functions in Salor scheme, pass arguments to the function through Grani, and also an important thing is you can have parameter linkage. So in the original Grani, every parameter was independent and they didn't know about each other. So it would be, again, without doing some trick like calling a bunch of instances of Grani with specific parameters, you wouldn't be able to say, okay, if a note has this frequency, have a high amplitude. Grani Plus allows you to do parameter linkage and write any code in Sal to relate the parameters to each other. This lets you do things like attractors, basically take what would be an amorphous cloud of sound and focus it in parts. So this is an example of what Grani Plus code looks like. So you have your normal call to Grani and just very few more lines of code here. This is just going to do a random change in sample rate. It's doing it in real time, or not in real time. But each grain, it jogs a random amount and changes the sample rate. So you can see how just a very simple call, 6 extra lines of code, lets you add this into it. Play this. Silly sound, but it demonstrates my point. The other thing this demonstrates is when you write a function to send to Grani, Grani will also send back to it any arguments you give it and the time ratio. The time ratio being the point in the note where you are. So the function can also know where in the entire duration of the granular succession you are. So you can allow it to change over time. So this one, for instance, it started off as a gentle drift and it got more and more active over time because of these factors here. So this lets you do envelope type things in the function, but to control any parameter you'd like, anything you've come up with, anything you've built into it.
So if down there s-rate dash fun, that line, if that was missing, it would be by default?
Yep, if this was missing, it would just behave like it was normal Grani, and it would default to the sample rate of 1, just no transposition. So this argument, s-rate fun, tells you what function are we looking at to decide the sample rate for each grain.
So the function you give it, your version is, I'm trying to understand this, it's calling it so you give it a function of 2 parameters and it's going to call your function whenever it needs to update something. Mm-hmm. The time ratio is something that it's calculating, and what are args? Args are the things that you pass in?
Yeah, you could also write, you can also send s-rate args. So, for instance, if you had a function that was picked from a list of envelopes to be the amplitude envelope for each grain, but you wanted to call several instances of this with a different set of envelopes for each one, you could feed that into args, and that way you only need to write one function. Yeah, so every function always gets sent time ratio from Grani. You don't have to use it, of course, and again, here I'm not using args either because I'm just doing one call as a demonstration. Does that make sense? Okay, so I have a few just examples I threw together in Grani Plus, and some brief examples of works in progress. So this first one is using a Markov chain to control pitch and grain selection, and it also uses parameter linkage to control, to link duration to grain selection. So certain grains, depending on where they are in the input file, are long, certain ones are short. So you can hear there's actually, I have created the input file, so Grani picks from discrete points in it, and based on what those are, it also knows what to do with the duration. So So here we have a recursive equation
Is that
controlling.
a sound file, or was it just generated?
These are all pre-recorded sound files. Yeah. So this is using a recursive equation to control other linked parameters. Using a filtered noise and a narrow filter to a source file. I call this regranularization. I've been experimenting with this, taking a sound that's pretty granular in nature, like in this case ripping Velcro. So the sound of ripping Velcro is already made up of hundreds of tiny little pips. And this, I've put those into a sound file, and it knows where to take each one and do kind of random drifts of frequency with it. So it starts off rhythmic and gets up to the sun. This next one is multiple runs through Grani. I wrote a function that links, it's again using a markup chain, but there's a fractal relationship between the different transpositions, and each one's convolved with a different, each one is convolved a different amount. So the first one's convolved once, the second one's convolved with itself twice, the third one so on. I think there's 4 layers. This next one I'm particularly proud
That
of.
was still the Velcro source sound?
Oh, no, that was,
Kurt, it would help to hear the sources of these things,
Mhm.
because it's hard to know what the transformation is about. Do you have the sources that we could hear, or?
yeah, I don't know where they are for the first 2, but
Okay.
I have for the second one. Let me show. Mhm. So that's the
That's the
Velcro.
Velcro one?
But I didn't take that audio file and work with it. I actually just took 8 individual of the pips from that and put them into their own sound file, so it would just sound like. Dan?
How are you involving the convolution in your Grani Plus call? Or is it a separate?
Yeah, the convolution is separate. These first 2,
You mean
it's
that
used.
it's separate, that it happened at the same time? That it was a separate action happening at the same time, or you did it after or before?
Oh, the convolution, I did it afterwards. It wasn't part of Grani Plus. These first 2, I don't know what the files are, but they're kind of, I think they're circuit bent sounds, so it just sounds like a keyboard dying. This last one, I do have the source. It's a brief excerpt from a Greek folk song called "The Blackened Stone Upon the Shore." So what I've done to it is kind of do an automatic double tracking, or triple tracking. So using the S-rate argument, there's a feedback control system built into it. Basically, over the length of the sound, normal behavior would be just go straight through it, from start to end. So this actually has random jitter. It's just doing Brownian motion, random walks. But the further and further away it gets from where it should be, it's pulled towards that point, harder and harder.
So back towards it, or what do you mean forward? Which way is it?
So there's two forces acting on the start position. You know, just this Brownian motion, just jitter, and also a proportional control to where it should be. So it's kind of this meandering thing in and around it. So I did several calls to that at once with different weightings. You get this kind of automatic heterophony. You know, I'm the bass player in Balkanalia, and so there's a lot of heterophonic things in that music. So you have a flute player and a violin player and a Godoko player all playing the same thing, ornamenting it differently. And so I was trying to think about how to implement something like that in a granular synthesis environment, and I came up with this. So you get 3 calls to Grani Plus, all running at the same time, with this automatic heterophony. The drone was a typo that actually ended up sounding really great. So the third voice, I had them all weighted by different amounts, so each one would jitter different weighting and would be pulled back where it should be. And I accidentally put the proportional control, you know, pulled where it should be, really